Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everybody. Welcome to the second part of our three-part series in live webcast, where we're going to talk about kind of leveling up and bettering your network management. I'm Kevin Sparenberg, and with me we have Chad from another office. Say hi, Chad.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining.
We're not going to spend a lot of time on a bunch of preamble. If you saw the first portion, we talked about kind of how to go through and make sure your ISPs and your service providers were being honest, using NetPath and some of the add-ins for that. And this time we're going to talk about the real deep dive information you need on certain devices, because we get the questions a lot about why do I need to monitor things differently? And well, Chad, I know you've run into this before where people will like monitor a router and they'll monitor the firewall the same way. And that's just not really the correct way.
Right. It's definitely not a cookie cutter approach anymore. It might have been a long time ago, actually, but things are evolving quite rapidly. And I think you have to kind of evolve with it to try and keep up with all the changes that are kind of being thrown at any kind of network admin these days.
Yeah. And the one thing that I've always thought of is when you think about a firewall, and we're going to concentrate on firewalls obviously a little bit, but when you think about a firewall, underneath all the layers of the security and the VPN and the IPsec tunnels and all that, when you get down all the way to the bottom, it essentially is just a router. But the things that are important to a router aren't important to a firewall. I mean, bandwidth, utilization, CPU, memory, storage, that's fine for a router, but there's so many things we're missing. And we want to show you those. But before we dig into the firewalls, we want to start with something in the same vein, but a little different. We're actually going to start with load balancers, because a lot of people are using these for hosted sites, or if you happen to be a company that runs a pseudo SaaS type scenario. Load balancers are one of those things that you're constantly dealing with and chasing down issues. And I personally have troubleshot them by hand, and I never ever want to do it again because it's painful and it's slow, and I'd rather have something do it for me. And Chad, you had some experience with this, right?
Yeah, in a former life, I actually worked for a SaaS-based provider, and so we actually dealt with tons of different web servers, had some load balancers, and to a degree, sometimes a load balancer can be a black box of it does so many different things, and trying to understand, well, how does it do those things, and does it do it in a way that you expect it to do? So it can be challenging to figure out all the interworkings of that kind of load balance environment. But one of the nice things, obviously, with what we're going to be showing is how can we make that simpler to understand, even if you were kind of first day on the job and understanding, well, how does all this interconnected configuration work within a load balancer?
Yeah, and for me, that's one of the things that I may be part of the networking team, but the services the load balancers are providing are actually consumed by the web team or the email team, or whoever's responsible for DNS. And being able to say, no, it's not a load balancer problem. Here's your service. Everything is clean. We can get that all in there and make sure that we're not spending cycles digging into something that is completely useless for the actual troubleshooting. So here we've got our load balancing dashboard. Honestly, it's really pretty, but it seems complex. And that's because we're showing everything in this entire environment. And for me, I don't necessarily have all the experience to understand all the various tiers here, but I do know that if I just click on this first one where we're having a problem, and then I show the relations, then I know that for this specific service, the service is down, the global traffic manager is having a problem, the local's having a problem, the virtual server is down, and probably that's why all the child members or reverse are down. So this covers a lot, but Chad, I know you know more about this, so I'll let you speak.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, at the end of the day, really what we're going for is you're presenting a service to somebody out there and understanding, is that service available? Is it functioning? Is it working? And with a load balancer, I mean, the service obviously is kind of the top of the food chain when it comes to that, but you're looking at a lot of layer 4, layer 7 routing within the environment. And so kind of a quick flashback for myself in that previous life working for the SaaS provider. Now, we had dozens and dozens and dozens of web servers. And, it was kind of that 3-tiered architecture where we had front-end web servers, we had our tier servers and we had backend database servers, and all of those pieces had to work and function exactly as expected. Otherwise, something would go wrong, and that's not what you want when you're providing a service to anybody. And so with the load balancing, we'd start in saying, okay, we're going to come in on, say, layer 4, right? We're going to come in on 443, and then it's immediately going to switch to now dissect the URL. We're switching to layer 7 and saying, well, if it's, coming in with URL / ABC, we're going to switch it over to these group of web servers. Or if it comes in with, DEF, we're going to bring it over to this other group of web servers. And so that kind of routing of traffic needs to be handled very delicately. And what's nice about this specific kind of F5 feature set is it kind of outlines that whole stack. Okay, well, if I'm presenting that service, what does the all the way through that stack to the back end actual web servers hosting that, and then kind of giving you an understanding of each piece of that puzzle, and then kind of then bringing it back into these kind of dashboard pages to give you that holistic view of what's going on.
And for this, we make calls to the API, right, for F5. Mm-hmm. So you define a set of read-only API creds, and then you put it into the system and you hit submit, and then it just starts building this, right?
Yep, it's pretty much automatic after that point. So what's interesting is, and this will kind of be a preface for really the entire discussion here, but SNMP has kind of always been a thing for forever as far as monitoring any network device. But there's been a shift in the industry over the past several years where maybe there's an API now that we have to interface with, or maybe there's only specific metrics that are available via SSH commands. And so what this is actually coupling is the ability to kind of pick any one of those avenues and then bring each one of those separate individual pulled metrics back into a single spot. So with this F5, we start with SNMP, but not everything is available via SNMP. So F5s have their own API. So we can then additionally assign, say, well, here's some API credentials that we can use to log in that kind of fills in the gaps that SNMP didn't have. And all of a sudden we can take that back now to kind of these pages to say, well, this is really kind of what's happening under the hood, and kind of pinpointing that. And you'll kind of see that through the different devices outside of just F5 too, where you're using SSH or API, and then eventually we'll bring all of that data back into one view so you can see kind of the true story.
Yeah, because it's interesting. We'll use SNMP to get like CPU memory storage, the basic stuff you get from pretty much every SNMP provider. But this kind of configuration layers, that's the stuff we could probably get it through some type of CLI, but it would be so egregiously large to parse through and make sense of. And F5 wrote a really nice API where you can just basically make a call, give it a parameter, and it'll return just the things for that. So we just do that and then parse through that to build this. And it's pretty quick.
And in that former life, I was explaining to my team, this is how it's configured. This is how all those pieces kind of work. And it was still incredibly challenging for anyone to kind of just walk in and know that. And even if they had been there for some time, sometimes, they missed that one piece of connection. And I eventually had to build Visio diagrams of pretty much what this is already giving to you.
No.
Hey, I know, it was terrible. But this is so much easier because I don't have to worry about, doing a Visio, which is going to be out of date, and then all of a sudden you do that small config change and now path change and you have to update it. Like this will see those, kind of reading the config, and then it's just going to make changes as you make changes to the environment and kind of as it grows naturally.
Yeah. And we can get into all the various detail pages on this if we really wanted to, but we wanted to kind of just encourage people to give it a try it out, understand that we're going to have all this information available. I mean, the local traffic manager. And of course, if you just want to kick the tires without actually using it in your environment, you can always go to oriondemo.solarwinds.com and play around in there. It's actually where we're running right now. Okay, so we checked off firewalls, we checked off load balancers. Let's talk about Cisco ASAs, because this is, I want to say it's my first introduction to firewalls, but I actually did run a PIX 525 for a while, which was an absolute nightmare, just because I was learning firewalls and learning that. And the ASA was significantly easier. So yeah, the important things are that traffic is moving. But the question really is it moving where I want, to whom I want, and all my tunnels up, and some of that stuff comes in cleanly and easily through the CLI, but I don't want to be there over time. Like, show tunnel, enter, all good, up, enter, still good, up, enter. Don't do that. You can do it, but it's just so much easier to put it in here and let this system do it for you. And we try to bubble up kind of the most important information here to the top. So we have the firewall information, obviously the version, everything's running. We have some details on it. And one thing that we don't actually have in the demo, but is completely supported, and I've seen a lot of customers with it, is down here at the bottom, you see that we've got this admin context. And I had to have someone explain to me how contexts work based on my knowledge of how systems and virtual machining works. Like, that's how I had to wrap my head around it. And there's probably some nuance there I'm missing. But I know that you can build a security context, and then a web-only context, and then one for email, and they all basically have their own configs. And we recognize that and see them all independently and make sure we can monitor them for most of this information.
Right, and I was going to add, just like how we were looking at the F5s, for all of this ASA stuff, those security contexts, the web context, all of that stuff isn't really there through SNMP. So this is actually some information that we can do some read-only SSH commands to kind of go in and say, well, what are you really doing? And how can we then bring that back to say, this is what it is, this is actually what it's doing and how it all relates to each other. And then really after you define kind of that SNMP and SSH information, the rest of these pages kind of auto-populate with the data, because we're trying to bring that kind of best practice approach into monitoring the NASA in this case, so that really anyone can kind of just see this data and start running with it.
Yeah, and this is a slightly modified node details page. It's probably familiar for most people who've worked with Orion, but there's some extra things. But the one that really sets it apart for me, at least, is the platform. And the platform really brings it out for me for two things. Number one, I've got my standby information, whether or not my standby is ready and active, whether the configs have replicated. So I know that if this is green all the way across, then in the event of some type of power and or hardware failure, it's clean. I know I will be okay. I'll still get a notification because we're monitoring both sides of it, but the services it's providing, even if there's a blip, won't be gone completely.
Yeah, and really this page is a good building point from what you had mentioned earlier, Kevin, where a firewall kind of is a router to a degree, but there's so much more that it is, and you can't just monitor it like you would a router in the past. Like the high availability status, you're seeing connection counts, connection rates. Those were all things that I had to do manually in a previous life. Go find the SNMP OID and find this manual monitor to go get these metrics so that I could actually see it. But we're kind of recognizing that these are important things to monitor out of the gate for a firewall, and we're kind of just giving that to you on the page here.
Yeah, and if we continue along the thread of what's important, well, if you happen to be using VPN tunnels for site-to-site communications between your branches in your data center or your data center in the cloud or something like that, this is kind of important. I need to know the status of these. And some of them realistically are probably stand-up teardowns at vendor endpoints or something like that. But some of them are important enough, like the ones you can mark as a favorite, some of them are important enough that you need to know about them all the time. And although this page doesn't really indicate what the star does, what the star does is it boils it back up to that main page. And for me, forget general status. For me, this is the breadwinner here. It's where is it failing, in what part of the process, and also if it is in place, how is it actually handling the encryption in that VPN? Because maybe I have, maybe I'm not supposed to be using MD5 hashing. Maybe I'm supposed to be using a different algorithm based on organizational reasons. And if I see a couple of these come up and say, hey, we're using MD5, I'm like, we need to go and make a config change there.
Yeah, and there is just a ton of really good data. And I mean, I'm sure you and I both love as much as like, well, we'll just ping something on the far end of the tunnel, and then if that goes down, then maybe the tunnel's having a problem too. But, this is kind of, again, going in through SSH, running some, show commands for VPN tunnel status, and then coming back and say, this is what we're getting, parsing it for you, and then giving kind of that pertinent data of saying, well, yes, it's up, and this is the data, or, hey, it's down, and this is where it's kind of failing, phase one, phase two, all of that good stuff for continued troubleshooting.
Yeah, and for me, it's I can continuously troubleshoot myself. You talk, the show VPN tunnel status, enter, or show VPN status with the name, enter. I can do that. But I would normally do that when someone calls me and says, hey, I can't get to some resource, which means I'm being reactive to the problem. By letting the Orion system, and specifically NPM, do this work for you, you become proactive. You know before that phone rings, as if anyone uses a phone anymore, but before that phone rings and says, I'm having a problem getting to the data center in Boston, or something like that.
Yeah, so much better to have kind of that proactive approach, because then you can instantly say, so that when you do get the call, you say, well, yeah, I see it too. We're working on it, right? Mm-hmm. And that type of change is so much better from a perspective standpoint when you're working with all these end users, to have all of that data up front for you.
Yeah. And then the other thing that for me, and we ran into this a lot at my last organization, we were a Cisco house, so we were running the ASAs as our firewalls. We actually had, I think it was configured where there was a pair that was basically for our web traffic, and then we had a separate pair just for our VPN, because we had lots and lots of users and we wanted that. But understanding whether people are currently connected, how long they're connected, who they are, and how much traffic, because this will vary greatly, and this is mostly a read-only resource, but this is incredibly powerful for troubleshooting. This is the kind of thing that I would make sure this page is accessible to my help desk, so that when they get a call from, I don't know, HLY, and HLY says, I can't get in, they're like, well, you were in 2 days ago, let's go ahead and troubleshoot that. Or if you see there's some type of problem, you can always work with that.
Yeah, and one of the things I feel like I fought often in a former life was, a user saying, I'm trying to connect and I can't, and then you log in and they have some, hung session on the VPN concentrator that just never cleared. Yeah. But you can actually get status of, hey, these are who are connected, these are who are, disconnected, like this is how long they were connected for. Like this data, like you said, is awesome. And so, giving any of this data out to other people can just then further help that troubleshooting aspect. And then kind of in the same vein, since we're tracking this, you can then start to get some patterns of, okay, well, how many concurrent sessions do I have? This played a big factor in the past year. How many, people working from home do I have? And, what's my total count? What's my peaks? And that can, again, kind of help you, troubleshoot if there are issues, if there's a lot connected, or maybe it's just kind of from a long-term approach of, do we have enough licenses or bandwidth or things that can handle that kind of volume if you get up there.
Yeah, and for me, this is something that also, especially over the last year, has been interesting for people dealing with split tunnel versus full VPN, especially as organizations have moved to more SaaS-like solutions. Then I don't necessarily need everyone on full tunnel all the time, just binding up whatever bandwidth I have. And there's ways to filter this off. You can look at their client version, you can look at the way they're connected, you can look at the groups they're in. And if you see if you see a huge spike in this number, then maybe they're not actually incorporating these SaaS solutions, the Microsoft 365 or the Salesforce. They're not incorporating them, and they're still using the VPN when they don't need to. And that kind of dovetails into the access lists a little bit. And honestly, these are great, but everything here is fun. This is the only thing I care about, though. I hate to say it, but manually editing ACLs is probably the biggest pain I ever had to deal with in any security administration ever. And invariably, I'm glad I didn't have this at my last company, because if I pointed at this whole thing would be red and yellow, because I know the rules worked, but they didn't work the way they should. Because all of these rules, and at least for the Cisco stuff, the way that I understand it is that when the ACLs get built, all of that gets loaded into memory so that it can process. So it doesn't have to go back to the disk or whatever. And if you have a lot of these that are overlapping, duplicates, ones that conflict, all of that is taking place in memory, chewing up the resources and pulling down the possible performance of that device.
Yeah, and Kevin, I mean, sarcastically speaking, I'm sure you never had to walk into an ACL that you didn't create, right? So I'm sure you just, it's super easy to just, exactly, I created this so long ago and I'll just, build on it. Walking into somebody else's configuration can be challenging because maybe they didn't use standardization. Maybe they did it for some one-off use case that was pertinent for 1 week, and then they didn't, get rid of the ACL and it's still just lingering there. Like there's so many scenarios where ACLs can just be kind of a rat's nest of all sorts of things, and unbundling that can be challenging.
Yeah, even looking at them in the CLI is non-trivial. It's huge, it's deep, and understanding, oh, this one inherits these types of things and this one inherits these types of things, and going back and forth it's annoying. And if you do things right, and that depends on your organization, you define groups and then you put those groups into the ACLs and then you do this, and maybe you have a standard, but being able to actually see that, a change was made here. I want to look for this very specific ACL. I want to look at the change. Oh, well, here's the change. Oh, well, this has the remark, and we're supposed to always remark ours so that we know what we're doing. So this one is fine, except this is at 153 and this is at 207. So someone actually took that remark off for some reason. Oh, they also changed a couple other settings. But being able to actually see this and have this surface to you so you can understand the changes, so you're not doing, I always called it stare and compare, where you open like 2 notepad windows and then you go line by line to see what changed. You know what I'm talking about. We've all done it. We're ashamed that we had to, but we did.
Yeah, and the other thing that I kind of like, all of the different object groups that you might have, they're hyperlinked. Like you can click on them and say, well, if it's, this object name, like who is that? Like what IPs or what ports or whatever it is that I'm looking for. And, we can click on it and it just says, okay, well, yeah, this is what this object is inside the firewall. This is the host. This is, the group. This is whoever it might be. So you don't really have to question too much. We kind of give that to you in this page.
And that's the part where you're constantly going back to the definition over and over and over again, and being able to have it here where it's cleaned up is honestly a whole lot better. Like this here, this probably should be some type of group, and someone probably didn't follow best practices for this, and this should be defined in a group and given a name, and then we'd get another access list change.
Yep.
All right, so if we continue on the idea of firewalls, one of the other major vendors we deal with a lot are Palo Alto. And Palos I've only ever worked on the web side of Palos. I know they have a CLI that you can do stuff in, but there's a whole lot of functionality they give you, and a lot of it parallels. But for me, the important part for Palos is, again, we get the site-to-site VPN. We get slightly different information because the Palos provide slightly different information. So we can up-level that to everybody and make sure you have the information that you need for, filter on the type of hashing. I want to see only the ones with SHA-1. Okay, cool. But making sure that we can surface whatever information is going to help you troubleshoot problems faster.
Yeah, and then there's definitely some overlap between the kind of Palo Alto monitoring and the ASAs, because at the end of the day, they're both firewalls. But then obviously we're trying to go to maybe some of the uniqueness from each of the vendors, and still trying to present that data to you so you can kind of see it. So you can still get site-to-site tunnels. You can still get the Global Protect VPN users on the Palo Altos. That still comes through. So no difference there. All the troubleshooting that we kind of mentioned is still available. And then this is where we start to get into some of the policy areas of Palo Alto. So how kind of we looked at the ACLs on the ASAs, and now we can drill into the policies. And again, this is data we're getting through SSH, parsing config backups and doing a bunch of other things to figure out what's going on. But, you can continue to drill into the Palo Alto policies to get, even more data about what's going on. So, it's kind of a snippet of the configuration on the left. I can see what's going on. But then what's unique here is when you export NetFlow data from your Palo Altos, we're actually parsing NetFlow data and then matching it up to policy. So you can actually see traffic stats per policy in your NetFlow information, which is awesome. Like you can actually just see what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that for me is kind of the big differentiator. It's just a whole lot easier to understand based on what I can see. And for me, this kind of conversations is really important. In this case, these are very low numbers, but in real environments, this will be incredibly high, because most of these policies are built around very specific scenarios. They're built for a tunnel to another location. They're built for a data center to data center site reliance. They're built for a backup to some type of solution.
Yeah, and Kevin, if you scroll down real quick, on this page, so there's that kind of widget, other firewalls using this policy. So Palo Alto has kind of their centralized management through Panorama. So you can say, well, I have this policy here, but is it being inherited with other firewalls, in other areas of my network? And so we'll kind of outline, say, okay, yeah, there's maybe 2 or 3 or a dozen firewalls that might be inheriting this specific policy. And again, we kind of show and outline that information here on the page. So in this case, it was just one other firewall, but you can say we can see the inheritance here of the panorama.
I also like this where it actually breaks out the applications in the groups, because that's stuff you could possibly hunt down and just take too long. And now I know that these are the ones that apply to that particular profile, like in a second.
Yep.
So we talked about firewalls, which are basically glorified styles of routers. We haven't talked about switches. And I want to spend a little bit of our last bit of time talking about Nexus switches, because Nexus, the Cisco Nexus series really started to replace a lot of the kind of catalyst level things. The top of rack switches used to be like 3750s or 3850s, and they've gone to the Nexus 5Ks, and then you've got one on that end of your data center and one on that end of your data center, and they've got a channel between them, and you've got your 7000s running anything, and maybe you got the 9000 orchestrating all of that stuff. But there is a very specific technology when it comes to the way Nexus handles things that I think we do incredibly well, and probably better than, I know it's better than doing it by hand, but probably better than I've seen done anywhere. And all it is this. And I know everyone who's watching is like, it's just a list. Yes. Yes, it is just a list. But it is also one of the most important lists because of the functionality you get with it. So if you're not familiar with a VPC, you probably aren't working with Nexus, but the really short definition is a virtual port channel between devices that have member port channels on either side, but they don't have to be directly connected. There's a whole lot of nuance to it. If you really want, you can read about it on Cisco, but the important part is they have to be defined on both sides, and they have to be members on both sides. So there's kind of this inheritance, because if you think about it, there's interfaces, and interfaces, one or more, can be part of a port channel, and then that port channel can be part of this virtual port channel. So you're talking this hierarchy that's, well, it's tough to visualize, at least in a reasonable way.
Right, and it kind of goes along with what we've mentioned in other areas where, I could go and I could do some show commands to try and figure it out. And like you had mentioned, I could do Notepad side by side to try to figure out what's doing what on this side and what's doing that on the other side, and do they match? And but this just makes it so much easier to comprehend and see, it just on one page what's going on.
Yeah, and for me, it's first and foremost, this is not the way my Nexus would look, because the VPC numbers do not match the port channel numbers, but that's a me thing. I like the consistency. Okay, so 50 is all right because it's using VPC 50 and it's port channel 50 on each side and it has a bunch of members. Cool. But when you have one that's in a warning state, well, the port channel is actually okay on both sides. So why is it warning? Well, all 3 interfaces are good here. Oh, there's a 4th interface here that's unknown, which probably means it's unplugged. And that's a problem. Now, do you need 4 and 3? No, this might be one that was orphaned in this port channel. So hey, I can take ETH 1.5 out of port channel 30 on Nexus 2. And if you notice here, we're on Nexus 1. So we're actually reading these configs from the far device, the other side. So we understand how these are built together. And again, we get the information, we parse it out, and the config snippets, being able to compare them. We'll actually break this into 2 sections. One is kind of the top level definition, because this is where you're supposed to say which VLANs are allowed and or denied, and put some other information in there. But then being able to see the interfaces on 1 versus 2, because these should match up. I can't think of a scenario where they shouldn't, but I'm not the most clever person, so there may be a scenario where they shouldn't match up. But
yeah, and again, just having that information. I mean, technically we're pulling from 2 different devices, but then seeing the relationship between these 2 here on the page is huge.
Anything else that we hadn't covered, Chad? I know we're technically over, but I like to just keep these conversational. So,
Right. I think maybe just going back to kind of the basics of these are not difficult to set up. I mean, really, we're asking for SNMP, like maybe an SSH service account, an API service account of some kind. Now, what I found in talking with a lot of different customers is that, I add these devices in Orion. Right? I go add a node, SNMP, and I'm done. But there's actually a checkbox, in that edit node page where I can then further define the API or SSH information. And then once I get there, then again, we can then, see all these extra dashboards that we just showed and kind of, start gleaning all this new information that we maybe weren't monitoring before.
yeah.
So we try and make the setup, as easy as we can.
Yeah. And I'm going to see if I can't find that so people understand exactly it's a checkbox and a set of creds. It really is that simple. And I've spoke with customers when we used to go to shows. I've talked to customers on webinars and webcasts and even kind of pseudo face-to-face like this where they just didn't realize they could do this. So it's something you're going to skim by, especially if you just do network discoveries. Because network discoveries aren't going to do this level. But you, as an engineer, know that it's going to have these things. So this is a Nexus. It's just an example. The other ones basically behave the same way. And you just come down. And I hope I don't scroll too far. There you go.
Right
CLI
there.
polling settings. Enable. Put in username, password, port, hit test. That's it. You're done. Same thing applies for the Palo Altos. Now, the CLI in this case means ASAs and Nexus, I believe. And part of this process is we go and we ask the device what it is so we can understand what to do after that fact. ACIs will do, Palo Altos will do. And it's just about surfacing all this information as quickly as possible so you can consume it, so you can help your end users or your customers or whomever is connecting to these types of service be able to do their job. I mean, ultimately you want to close the case or the ticket or the incident, but it's all about getting people back to a safe space. All right.
Yeah, and really, if you would think, trying to build this type of monitoring without kind of this network insight stuff, I mean, you're spending weeks and months to find OIDs or find the show commands, and then how do I insert those into a monitoring platform that can then read and parse and do all these things, and then on top of that, make it into a display that is, easy to read and easy to use. Like, there was a lot of thought that went into kind of this whole network insight approach, and it really tries to take some of the time of manually doing these things off of the back of kind of that network admin. So again, they have that kind of that more time to do other more important things, as part of their responsibilities.
Yeah, and then you can take that information, and if you need to up-level that to anybody who may not have the knowledge level you do as one of the admins of this, you can throw that into an Orion map and make sure that's shareable, and then I don't know if you need much more explanation than this. I'm looking at it, I'm seeing there's something not quite right here. It looks like a blown fan. This has a problem, and this is most definitely a problem right now. And that kind of visual learning, anything from the F5s all the way to the Nexus stuff, any kind of that visual learning and visual notification is just another way where you can get started on the problem faster and stop chasing red herrings.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, we're after. I don't see anyone bubbling anything up in the chat. I guess everyone who's been chat moderators, thanks everybody, first and foremost, who's been chat moderators. You've probably been answering the questions before we can even get to them. But I want to remind everybody that there is going to be a poll in the chat. We want to know what you think about this because we want to continue doing a series like this, and it would be helpful to understand what you're looking for. And that helps guide our decision-making process here at SolarWinds. Also, there's part 3 of this, which is turning cross-stack correlation into better collaboration. That's on June 17th, same time as this, 11 Central, if you happen to be Central. And I'll be joined by, I believe, Matt will be joining me to talk over that one. Chad, parting words, sir?
I appreciate everyone that was on. Kevin, thanks as always for your expertise in all these areas. So.
No, thank
really
you, sir.
Appreciate it.
So for Chad, myself, the video team, and everyone on the chat moderation, I want to thank you for joining this live webcast, and we'll see you next time.